Well, welcome back to the HDR Masterclass. This segment is a continuation of our discussion of HDR capturing. This will be an important segment because it's going to move us into actual capture for HDR photography. So, welcome back. Let's continue. So, let's take a look at the camera's live view. This happens to be a Canon 6D. This is what the LCD is showing us. I'm using this particular live view display to give you an appreciation for the kind of information that your camera will provide when you're in the field capturing for HDR. Now, this happens to be a Canon 6D. A Canon 6D is a wonderful camera. It's full frame. It's kind of like a mid-level camera. It's and much of the display information that the Canon 6D will give us, you'll also find on other DSLRs that are a little bit lower level, less functionality. Much of the information that's displayed will be on the lower level cameras as well as the high end. And many of these types of displays and the information being provided by the display will also be available on mirrorless. And certainly mirrorless cameras can be used in HDR photography equally as well as DSLRs. So let's get started by reviewing some of the information that is relevant to HDR capture. Now you'll notice here that we have, I've placed yellow check marks around, and those particular settings are important to us in HDR field capture. So that's why they're checked yellow, and that's what I'm going to focus on as we move along. Now the first one that we want to take a look at is the AV. This is indicating that the camera is currently set up in Aperture Priority mode. I personally have found that Aperture Priority mode for HDR field capture is actually quite good. And essentially that means that I am in control of the f-stop, and I've chosen a particular f11 here, and the camera in Aperture Priority mode will actually handle the shutter speed. Now, let's continue on here. You'll also note that the camera is currently set for a timer of 2 seconds. I found that it's very important for, while you're capturing for HDR, to have the minimum camera shake possible. And so I've found that I use the 2-second timer because I can click the shutter button and then hands off. And this way the camera will go through its automatic exposure bracketing, which we'll talk about in a minute here, with minimum shake or minimum disruption of the image from one exposure to the next. So that's why I have it set up for 2-second timer. I have the camera set up here in spot metering mode, and the idea here is to allow your camera to have exposure metering in just a particular spot on the within the frame. You really don't want an exposure metering that is across the entire frame. Now keep in mind that with HDR photography, we're trying to do a capture sequence that will give us a series of single frame images that we can then use in tone mapping, where we merge the multiple sequences. It could be 3, 5, 7, or 9 sequences. We'll get to more about a little bit later on. But the idea is to have the camera meter with the smallest possible area of the scene. I like to put the metering the spot metering right in the middle of the frame. You can certainly, with many cameras, you can move it anywhere you want in the frame. I like to do right in the middle, but that's my preference and that's worked best for me. Let's continue talking about some other settings. This is, I've set the camera in RAW. If you remember from a previous segment, we were discussing the damage that is done by in-camera compression to JPEG. By setting it in RAW, what you're doing is you're having the camera output your captured sequence with the minimum or none, depending upon the manufacturer of the camera, no internal processing of the images that come out with your bracketed sequence. No, you don't want any actual in-camera processing. So I've always avoided JPEG when it came to field captures for HDR. Let's talk about the histogram. You'll note here that the histogram is being displayed on the back of the camera's LCD. The most of your DSLR and many of your mirrorless will provide you with an on-screen display of the histogram. The histogram is going to be quite important to our actual field capture, and I think you'll appreciate that as we go along. Now, another thing is your ISO. What I recommend, and what has worked very well for me, is to have the lowest possible ISO setting for all of your captured sequences. The idea is that you want an ISO setting that is going to give you the greatest detail across all of your captured sequences, and in combination with, as we had talked about before, the RAW mode. Now, between RAW and a low ISO, and even the Aperture Priority, what you're and also the timer, so that you can have a sequence of captures with hands off, minimum camera shake. A combination of all of these will give you the best possible quality across all of your images. And do keep in mind that, as I have mentioned before, we're actually shooting a series of 8-bit images, and we want the best possible quality that we can get across all of those captured images, so that we have the best possible results when we go to tone map. And do keep in mind that we're taking this series of 8-bit images and we're going to be merging those together into a 32-bit. Well, here's the point. If you have a capture sequence where the images are of a lower quality, maybe the ISO is a little bit too high, for the scene, for that particular scenario, or you have some camera shake that's going on, well, you're going to damage the end result of your tone mapping. Do keep in mind, that's a 32-bit image that we're working on. And so if you have flaws in your captured sequence, those flaws are going to show up again as you process your final image. And certainly, if you're in a 32-bit mode, something that is damaged in the original 8-bit images, whether it be 1 or 2 or all of the images, is actually going to be exaggerated as you merge it into a 32-bit. So this is what I was referring to way back in the beginning of this course, where I was saying that we want to take optimum field captures for HDR photography. And many of these settings here are attempting to get you to a point where your captured sequence is actually optimum. All right, so that's enough for the what the LCD screen of your camera is showing. You're probably going to have most of these capabilities in most cameras. You may see some of them are lacking in certainly compacts. Smartphones may not have all of these capabilities, but your typical low to mid-range consumer digital SLRs will have virtually all of these capabilities, and certainly high-end cameras as well. Now, don't be too intimidated by this slide. I'm going to take each one of these steps, I'm going to break it down, and I'm going to describe it in much more detail. But I do want to stay on this slide for just a few minutes to give you an appreciation for what it is that we're trying to do in this captured sequence methodology. Now, this particular sequence is something that I have developed over the years in my own practice of HDR photography. And it may look complicated, but we're going to boil the whole thing down and try to give you an appreciation for generally what we're trying to do. Now, I'll give you a brief explanation of what all of these steps are trying to do. And here it comes. It is a matter of finding the point at which you have no clipping on the dark side and you have no clipping on the white side, the highlight side. And then once you've determined where your exposure setting should be for no clipping on the dark and no clipping on the white, no clipping on the shadow, no clipping on the highlights, you want to put that center frame right in the middle. And then when the camera takes a series of photos using the automatic exposure bracket, boom, 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 the idea is that you have actually placed the series of images in such a way that you're capturing enough frames where you're getting all of the light intensities of that particular scene within that captured series. So, this sequence here basically does this. You will find the point at which you don't have any clipping on the shadow side, the dark side. Then you're going to find the point at which you don't have any clipping on the highlight side, the white side, and then the middle point, the middle exposure, is going to be, well, pretty much determined by the camera, and then you're going to take your sequence. So, this particular sequence, I should say method or sequence, is really intended to have the minimum in-field hassle. And I have found that I can very quickly meter for no clipping on the shadows, no clipping on the highlights, and then automatic exposure bracket, doom, 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 and I'm done. And that's my sequence. And most of the time, I actually come back and engage in tone mapping, where I've actually achieved the best possible results in my capture sequence. All right. So, we're going to take a little break here, and then in the next segment, I'm going to be going through each one of these steps. So I'm going to talk about step 1, step 2, step 3, 4, 5, and 6. And the idea is to show you how that sequence will get you the best possible results. Now keep in mind, in HDR field capture, the quote-unquote best results or optimum sequence of captures is a combination of getting a series of photos where you are covering all of the light levels or the light intensities within that scene. Now keep in mind that the camera itself may not be able to do that for a particular scene with a single exposure. You may take the first one, and that has clipping on the, say the shadow side. Another frame will have clipping on the highlight side, and another frame perhaps in the middle somewhere will have clipping, well, possibly even on the shadows and the darks. Across the entire sequence, when we go to merge all of those frames together, the idea is that we have we'll be able to, in tone mapping, be able to have all of the light range, the dynamic range of that scene in all of the captured sequence. So, all right, so what we're going to do now is take a little break, and then when we come back, we're going to be talking about each one of these steps. And I think by the time you're done looking at this particular sequence, you're going to realize that shooting for HDR in the field is really not difficult, and it really can be automated. We're going to be using the camera's AEB, and of course, the sequence of find no clipping on the shadow, find no clipping on the highlight, and then your center point is pretty much determined for you, and then shoot and move on. Do it again and again and again. So this is what I have found makes it possible for me to use HDR methodology on a regular basis, because I'm not out in the field all trying to mess with this and figure all this out all the time. I pretty much have an automated sequence. And I am delighted that I'm able to share with you the sequence of capturing in the field that I have found has worked for me, which makes me a very happy person when I go to utilize HDR photography. So I'll see you in the next segment. We'll talk about each one of these steps.